everyone. In this video, I want to talk about the causes of the French Revolution and the first two phases. I've broken the French Revolution into 4 phases. So this is video 1. First, to understand the French Revolution, it's important to talk about why it actually happened. The first main issue is military reasons. France's major political enemy in the 18th century is going to be Britain. Now, again, we're not going to go back and do all the different wars that are happening, but basically between about 1701 up through the 1760s, so about a 60-year period, England and France were fighting a number of different wars, mostly abroad. So in what we would recognize as Canada, in today's United States, in areas like India, in their colonial holdings, they're fighting for territory and control. And on the whole, France is going to lose every single one of those wars, which means that France just gets more and more angry at the British because they very much consider that it is Britain that is blocking their world domination dreams. Part of this conflict with Britain helps to explain why France participates in the American War of Independence, or the War of the American Rebellion, if you happen to be British. So, because if you think about it, this makes absolutely no sense. First of all, France is a monarchy, just like England. And so the last thing you really want to do is to encourage people to rise up against monarchies. The second thing is that this is a colonial holding, right? The American colonies are controlled by Britain. Well, France has colonies too. And really the last thing you should do is to encourage people to rise up against their colonial overlords. This also is going to make absolutely no sense. And so you have absolutist monarchy France fighting for the rights of people in the American colonies to overthrow a government. And of course, in America, as we've talked about in the Revolution, they're talking about inalienable rights and the fact that power comes from the people, not from God, and the fact that it's a social contract, and on and on and on. So this is crazy that France should support the colonists. However, if your main foreign policy goal is stop England at any time you can, then this does make some sense. And so the French, who were so important in the American Revolution, as we talked about, are going to get involved in this war. Now, it is the one war they win. Woohoo! They win and the British are defeated, but it has huge problems at home in France because they participated in this. So just know that basically the French are losing almost all of their military wars, their engagements, except for the American Revolution, which really makes very little sense if you're an absolutist monarchy. Now, losing all these wars or the money they spent on the American Revolution leads to huge economic problems because France has to borrow more and more money to pay for this. Wars are really expensive, and you can only tax your people for so long. And so the French begin to borrow a lot of money. The American Revolution is very, very expensive, and really they don't get a ton out of it. It's not as if the US pays them back for all the money that they spent on the revolution. And so as we get closer to the 1780s, when the revolution happens, France is in deep, deep economic trouble. She is having to spend a huge amount of her income on just servicing the debt, the interest on the debt that she owes because of all of these wars. On top of that, the system that's in place for tax collection doesn't really have any taxes on the rich. So the upper class, the nobility, and the church pay little to no taxes. So the people who have the money really aren't paying taxes. On top of that, as we get into the 1780s, there's going to be a whole series of bad crop years. Now, in the modern world, if there is a place around the planet where the crops fail and there are problems, you can just ship food in from anywhere. But you can't do that in the 18th century. And so as the crops fail, food prices go up. And so for the poor who were already barely making it, As their taxes increased, and now as food prices increased, we begin to see starvation. Now, that's not going to make anybody really happy with the government. And one of the problems when you have an absolutist monarchy is there's kind of one person to blame. It's the guy at the top, and that's going to be the king. So there's a very complex set of economic problems that are happening both long-term because of the debt and then short-term because of agricultural failures and other issues that are causing problems. And in the midst of this is Louis the 16th. Dear old Louis, there you can see him looking all noble with his robes. The problem with Louis is he was basically a pretty nice guy, but he was a horrible ruler. And that is not what you need in an absolutist system in crisis. So he wasn't very decisive. He tended to change his mind a lot. He didn't necessarily really know what was going on all the time because he stayed home in his palace in Versailles and allowed the people around him, his advisors, to tell him what was going on in the countryside. And they often told him a much more rosier picture than was actually happening. And then once he was kind of aware of what was going on, he couldn't figure out a really good system to fix the problems. He did talk about maybe raising taxes on the rich, but the rich didn't really like that. The nobility didn't really like that. He tries to do some changes. And so basically people become more and more convinced that there has to be a way to kind of bypass Louis in order to get changes. And so what comes up is the idea of calling the Estates General. So phase one, the Estates General. Now the Estates General is a part of the French government that can be called by the king, and it's representatives, both of the middle and the upper class and the church. And the idea here is that it can help the king the king consults it. It's a consultative assembly. It doesn't have the right to make laws. It doesn't have that type of power, but it is a body that the king can call to find out what's happening and to get ideas to fix problems. Now, calling the Estates General itself had problems. The first, as you can see, is that it wasn't called very often. So the last time it had been called, we're in 1789. The last time it was called was 1614. So 1614 to 1789 is a very long time. Nobody was alive the last time this was called. And so one of the issues is just how is this group going to work? I mean, who gets to vote the representatives and how does it meet? And I mean, just imagine in the US if we had Congress and it hadn't met for over 100 years and all of the senators and representatives were new. And I mean, it's just a mess. An important issue was how the vote was going to happen in the Estates General. Now, traditionally in the Estates General, there are 3 estates. The first estate is the church. They're closest to God. The second estate is the aristocracy. And the third estate is all the commoners, which is, of course, the very largest group. But the way that the Estates General worked is it voted by group rather than by head. So basically at the end, you ended up with 3 votes. Church got 1, nobles got 1, commoners got 1. And that means that there's a high probability that what the church and the nobility wants is always going to win out. So the delegates from the third estate, from the middle and lower classes, were asking that the vote be by head, by individual person, because there were more delegates from the third estate than the others. And that would give them a chance to actually put forth their measures. So the Estates General meets in 1789. The decision is to vote by group, not by head, to vote by group. And so the third estate breaks from the Estates General over that. They just say, we are not participating until this gets fixed. They go off to this tennis court. That's what's being illustrated in the painting by David. This oath of the tennis court, which says that they will not disperse from Paris until France has a constitution. So this is actually to jump all the way to have a constitutional monarchy, which would be a huge shift. So some people date the starting of the French Revolution with the tennis court oath, because here we have the delegates of the Third Estate saying we are not going to leave Paris until we are recognized as representing France and France has a constitution. Now, not too surprising, Louis and his advisors were not very happy with that, and there's a lot of moving back and forth. But rumors start that Louis is actually going to shut down the Third Estate. And so the people of France rise in rebellion to support the Third Estate. And so, especially in Paris, they rise, and this is the storming of the Bastille. So some historians date the start of the French Revolution to the storming of the Bastille, this rising up of the people of Paris to fight for the delegates of the Third Estate in order to be able to advance to constitution, to have a constitutional monarchy. This moves us then into this phase. So what happens then is that the Third Estate comes in, and they're going to form a group to create a new constitution and to help to rule until the new constitution is in place. So they do a few very important things I just want to emphasize quickly. First is one of the things that they do is they create the civil constitution of the clergy. Civil Constitution of the Clergy in 1790. And what they did is they decided to take all the land away from the church, which was a major landowner, in order to try to pay some of the debts that France had. Now, the problem with this is that the church, not too unexpectedly, isn't too happy about this. And for some people then, this raises the question about whether they can support the revolution, because here the church is condemning this action. And so can you be a loyal Christian and a loyal member of France? The second important aspect of this early phase is the new constitution itself is issued in 1791. It creates the constitutional monarchy, so Louis can't just do whatever he wants. Now, the system that is actually created really favors the middle class. It follows Enlightenment ideas. So basically, only those who are kind of from the upper middle class can actually vote, and the economic laws really protect them, not the average worker. And so for people who aren't rich white men, they're not going to really like the new system. It has a system of active and passive citizens. And so that's not what a lot of people fought for. Now, the other monarchs in Europe were not particularly happy that France had had this revolution and it had forced a constitutional monarchy on the king. And so other kingdoms that did not have constitutional monarchies were threatening France and basically saying that they needed to restore Louis to full power. Well, the new government was not going to do that. And so they decided to declare war against Austria and Prussia, two countries that had been threatening France. They also thought that this would be a quick victory, and so this would help to gain them more popularity in spite of the disappointments that surrounded the Constitution in 1791.